The dead man was sitting up straight when Cale Dunmore found him. Not breathing, that part was certain. The undertaker in Cressa Flats had already chalked the date on the pine box lid, already measured the shoulders. But whoever had arranged the body had set it at the small table in the back room of the telegraph office, hands folded over a sealed envelope, hat tilted down over the ruined face. The envelope carried one line of ink on the outside. For the man who comes asking. Cale had come asking. He always did. 12 years riding the circuit from Laredo to the high desert counties, collecting warrants the way other men collected debts. He was not afraid of dead men or dark rooms or the smell that came with both. He was afraid of the warrant folded inside the envelope. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Wherever you are, sending love your way. Because the warrant inside was dated 4 days earlier. It carried the territorial seal. It listed crimes committed across 3 counties in the past 2 weeks. Robbery, arson, the burning of a mill that killed a night watchman. The bounty was $800. The description matched Cale Dunmore precisely: height, the scar along the jaw, the gray-handled revolver he'd carried since Abilene. The name printed at the top was his own. Cale read the warrant twice before he folded it back along its original crease. He had ridden into Cressa Flats that morning chasing a different piece of paper, a posting nailed to the territorial board in Harwell Station 3 weeks earlier, offering $400 for a man named Elbert Pruitt, wanted for the armed robbery of the Larimer Savings and Loan. The posting described Pruitt as stocky, red-bearded, missing the tip of his left ring finger. It said he was last seen riding northeast along the Comanche Trace with 2 associates. It said he was dangerous and should not be approached without support. Cale had approached dangerous men alone for 12 years. He had found Pruitt's associates, 2 brothers named Foss, camped at a creek crossing 20 miles south, convinced them surrender was preferable to what awaited them otherwise, and delivered them to the territorial jail in Harwell. The brothers told him Pruitt had gone north to Cressa Flats, where a cousin kept a dry goods operation. Cale had ridden north. He had located the dry goods store, spoken briefly to the cousin, a nervous woman named Aldea who smelled of camphor and watched the door the entire time, and she had told him Pruitt was dead. She had pointed him toward the telegraph office. The dead man's hands were too clean for a man who had been riding for weeks. No trail dust under the fingernails. The boots had been polished recently, or had never been worn hard. Cale lifted the hat brim and confirmed what he had already suspected from the posture. This was not Elbert Pruitt. The jaw was narrow, clean-shaven, and the man had all 10 fingers. Someone had dressed a different body and placed it here for him to find. The envelope had been waiting. He tucked his own warrant into the inside pocket of his coat. Then he crouched and examined the floor around the table. No drag marks, no overturned furniture. The man had either walked in willingly or been carried by someone who knew how to carry a body without disturbance. Near the left table leg he found it almost by accident. A silver coin, flat side up, but when he turned it over he saw the reverse had been scratched clean and restamped with a small mark, a double loop like a figure 8 lying on its side. He had seen that mark before. He could not immediately place where. He pocketed the coin. The telegraph office door opened and a boy of perhaps 14 appeared, eyes wide, a folded receipt in his hand. He looked at the body. He looked at Cale. He ran. Cale let him go. Running toward someone would be admitting what he was beginning to understand, that someone had gone to considerable trouble to put him in this room, with this body, with this warrant, and that the boy was probably already running toward the sheriff's office. Walking away was not an option. He had learned that in Abilene in the winter of his 29th year, when he had walked away from something and spent the following decade measuring the cost. He would not make the same calculation twice. He sat down in the chair across from the dead man and waited. The sheriff arrived 8 minutes later, which told Cale the office was close. The man who came through the door was not what Cale expected. He was perhaps 50, lean, with a marshal's deputy star pinned crookedly to a civilian coat. He stopped when he saw Cale sitting calmly. "You the bounty hunter?" the man said. "I'm Cale Dunmore." The deputy's expression shifted in a way that lasted less than a second but that Cale had learned to read across a long career. It was the expression of a man who already knew the name. "I'm Deputy Harlan Setch," the man said. "The sheriff's out on a circuit. You want to tell me what happened here?" "I want to know who this man is," Cale said. "Because he isn't Elbert Pruitt." Setch looked at the body. Then he looked at the hat that Cale had replaced over the ruined face. "No," the deputy said carefully. "He isn't." That single word, the admission of it, offered without surprise, told Cale that Setch had known before entering the room. Which meant the story that had been prepared for him was already unraveling. And they were both now standing in the gap where the truth should have been. "I found this beside the table," Cale said, and held up the silver coin. Setch did not reach for it, but his eyes stayed on it for 3 full seconds. Changed understanding. The man accused is not the man in the box, and the deputy already knew. Cressa Flats had been a mining camp 11 years earlier, and had never quite decided what it wanted to become afterward. The main street carried 2 saloons, a hardware concern, a boarding house, the dry goods store run by Aldea Pruitt, a land registry office that appeared to have no customers, and a small jail constructed from leftover lumber that leaned slightly to the west as though considering departure. The telegraph office where Cale had found the body sat at the street's north end, sharing a wall with the undertaker's workshop. This struck Cale as either efficient or ominous. In Cressa Flats, he suspected it was both. He spent the first afternoon moving carefully through the town with the specific discipline he had developed over years of working in places where everyone knew something and no one would say it. Plainly, the undertaker was a woman named Bertha Claim, which was almost certainly not the name she had been born with, who told him the dead man had been brought to her door 2 nights ago by 2 riders she had never seen before. They had paid her in advance, cash more than she would have charged, and told her the body was to be held for identification. She described the riders as tall, wearing trail coats, one of whom had a habit of touching his belt buckle when he spoke. She could not describe their faces well because it had been after dark. "Did they give you a name for the deceased?" Cale asked. Bertha Claim opened a ledger. She turned it to show him. In the name column, someone had written, Elbert Pruitt. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the kind of hand that belonged to someone accustomed to keeping records. "Who wrote this?" Cale asked. "The taller one. He had a good hand for writing." At the telegraph office, working around the location where the body had been staged, Deputy Setch had removed it without ceremony. Which was another thing worth noting. Cale found the operator, a thin man named Goss who chewed tobacco aggressively and avoided eye contact. Goss confirmed that 3 messages had been sent from the office in the past week, all on the same account, all addressed to the Territorial Marshal's office in Alderton. He would not show Cale the copies of the messages. "Territorial business," he said. "Official correspondence." Cale asked if any messages had come in during the same period. Goss hesitated. A hesitation that lasted precisely long enough to confirm the answer was yes, and then said he couldn't recall. At the saloon called the Meridian, Cale spent 90 cents on a meal he did not finish and listened to the room. The piano player, a young man with a broken-looking wrist that had healed badly, played the same melody 3 times over the course of an hour, a simple sequence, C to G to E minor, repeated with a small variation at the end. Cale noticed it on the 2nd repetition and confirmed it on the 3rd. It was too deliberate to be habit. He catalogued it. The bartender was a man called Rowan who volunteered information without being asked, which in Cale's experience meant the information had been selected in advance. Rowan told him that a man named Cale Dunmore had been seen in town 2 weeks earlier. "Is that so?" Cale said. "Fits your description exactly," Rowan said, polishing a glass. "Several people remarked on it. Said he was asking about land claims out near the northern ridge. Did he cause any trouble?" "Left before anyone could ask." Rowan set the glass down. "Funny thing is, the mill burned that same night. Night watchman didn't make it out." Cale watched Rowan's face and saw that the man believed what he was saying, which made him more dangerous than a liar. Someone had shown him a man who matched Cale's description and told him it was Cale Dunmore. Rowan had remembered the face and attached the name. The memory was genuine. The attribution was false. The false suspect presented itself without difficulty. Aldea Pruitt, who had directed Cale to the telegraph office and who had known before he arrived that the body there was not her cousin. She had motive. Her cousin's crimes had presumably cost her reputation and possibly more, and she had demonstrated she could remain composed under pressure. Cale spent 20 minutes genuinely considering her. Then Deputy Setch made his first mistake. He came to Cale's boarding room that evening and told him that the territorial marshal was riding from Alderton and would arrive in 2 days, and that Cale should remain in Cressa Flats pending questions. What kind of questions? Cale asked. Routine, Setch said. And then, before leaving, you'd do well to stay away from the telegraph office, Mr. Dunmore. Goss is a nervous sort, gets confused easily. It was a warning dressed as a courtesy. Cale recognized the difference. After Setch left, Cale opened his coat and looked at the warrant with his name on it. He thought about who would benefit from an $800 bounty on Cale Dunmore, and why they would need to create that bounty through falsified crimes rather than collecting on something real. Changed understanding. The conspiracy required someone who could forge a warrant, stage a crime scene, and send telegraph messages to the territorial office. That was not Aldea Pruitt's capability. That required someone already inside the system. The northern ridge was 9 miles from town through increasingly broken country. Flat desert giving way to a series of shallow canyons carved by water that had stopped running before Cale was born. He rode out before sunrise, telling no one, and reached the ridge by mid-morning. The burned mill was still standing in the way that burned structures stand. Upright in silhouette, hollowed entirely within. The fire had been thorough. A professional fire, Cale concluded, walking the perimeter. It had started at 3 points simultaneously, which required planning and multiple sets of hands. A single man with a grudge used one source of flame. 3 ignition points was an operation. He found the night watchman's marker. A cross made from fence posts, stuck into the ash near what had been the main door, and stood before it for a moment. The watchman's name was not on the cross. Someone had known him well enough to mark where he fell and not well enough to remember what to write. Cale searched the edges of the burn zone for 2 hours before he found the horseshoe. It was half buried at the fire's southern edge, which would have been upwind, which confirmed someone had held horses there during the burning. The horseshoe was unusual. The toe was double-struck, creating a distinctive double-mark impression in the soft soil. He had seen that style of shoe once before. There was a farrier in a town called Ector Spring, 2 counties east, who made shoes that way. His name was Crandall. He had a particular method he had developed for working with horses that had hoofwall problems, creating extra support at the toe. Every horse he shod carried the same distinctive print. Ector Spring was where Cale had spent the winter of his 29th year, where he had walked away from something. His brother's name was Toby. Tobias Dunmore, 6 years younger, who had followed Cale into the life because Cale had not stopped him when he should have. Toby had been 17 when he rode with Cale's circuit. Not the bounty hunting, but the years before that, when Cale had belonged to a group of men who described themselves as independent contractors and whose actual occupation was considerably less defensible. Toby had been 19 when Cale left. He had told his brother he was done, that the work was making them into something neither of them should be. He had ridden away before dawn and had not turned back. Toby had stayed. Cale had not seen or contacted his brother in 12 years. He had heard, eventually, that Toby had spent several years in the territorial system, minor charges, reduced, released, and had made his way to somewhere in the eastern counties. He had told himself this was sufficient. He knew it was not. The farrier in Ector Spring was named Crandall Bauer. Cale knew him. Bauer had been in Ector Spring since before Cale's own time there. He shod horses for half the county, asking no questions, keeping meticulous records in a ledger he maintained with the same careful hand he used for everything. A good hand for writing. Cale sat on his horse in the shadow of the burned mill and worked through the geometry. Someone who resembled him, or who had been presented as him, had been in Cressa Flats 2 weeks ago, asking about land claims. The mill had burned that night. The horses used had been shod in Ector Spring, possibly by Crandall Bauer. A dead man with a forged identity had been staged in the telegraph office. A warrant had been created bearing Cale's name and description. Deputy Setch had known the dead man was not Pruitt. Telegraph messages had been sent to the territorial marshal. The silver coin with the double loop mark rested in Cale's pocket. He took it out and looked at it again. The double loop, a figure 8 on its side. Infinity. Or a brand. He had seen that mark branded into cattle once, on a ranch east of Ector Spring that had been operating under a leased land claim. He needed to look at a land registry. He turned back toward town, riding faster now, and arrived to find that the land registry office, which had appeared to have no customers, had been locked and its window boarded since the previous evening. According to the woman at the boarding house, the registrar had left on the afternoon stage. At the telegraph office, Goss was absent. The door was unlocked. On the operator's table, underneath a brass paperweight, Cale found what had been left behind. Not by accident but deliberately, he believed, by someone who wanted him to find it. It was half a page, burned along one edge, from what appeared to be a financial ledger. The remaining columns showed a series of land transactions, all in the Northern Ridge area, all conducted under company names that meant nothing to him. But at the bottom of the surviving half, in handwriting he recognized from the undertaker's ledger, neat, deliberate, practiced, was a partial name. Only the first half survived the burning. Dunn, changed understanding. The crimes attributed to Cale Dunmore were designed to destroy his credibility before he could discover that land near the Northern Ridge. Land he apparently had a claim to, was being transferred under false instruments. And the man orchestrating the forgery had his brother's careful handwriting. He found Toby in the canyon. Not by tracking or not only by tracking. He found him because Toby had left the burned ledger page for him to find, and the burned ledger page had led him back to the canyon. And in the canyon there was an abandoned silver operation that had been shut down 11 years earlier when the vein played out. The old shaft entrance was blocked with timber, but the equipment shed beside it was intact and its door had been opened recently. Toby was 31 years old and looked older by a margin that the intervening 12 years could not fully account for. He was sitting on an overturned cart with his hands visible, which Cale understood as a signal that he had been waiting and did not intend sudden moves. He was thin in the way that men who have spent time in territorial prisons are thin, but his eyes were clear. "I wondered if you'd work it through," Toby said. "The ledger page," Cale said. "You left it." "I left it when I realized it had gone further than I could stop alone." Toby looked at his hands. "I need you to understand what I did and why. In that order." Cale sat on a timber brace across from his brother and listened. Toby had been working for a land speculation operation for 3 years. The operation was run by a man named Fincaraday, who held the position of territorial land registrar for the Eastern District, which meant he had access to filing records, claim documents, and the procedural authority to certify transfers. Faraday had been quietly rewriting land claims along the Northern Ridge Corridor, a stretch of territory that new railway survey maps had identified as the likely path for the next trunk line. Land that had been worthless desert 6 years ago was now worth between $40 and $200 an acre to the right buyers. Faraday was buying it for cents using forged transfer documents and selling it forward at full value. Toby had been hired as a record keeper. He was good at the work. He had not known, initially, the full scope of what he was copying. When he understood, he had made a copy of the key ledger before Faraday could destroy it. "And you sent that copy to the territorial marshal's office," Cale said. "I sent it 3 weeks ago. Goss at the Telegraph, he's Faraday's man. I knew he'd intercept anything sent through the office, so I rode to Harwell and sent it from there." "The marshal is riding here now," Cale said. "I know. That's why Faraday moved fast." Toby met his brother's eyes. He needed someone to blame before the marshal arrived. Someone whose description he could use. Someone with enough history that the story would hold. Cale absorbed this. He had someone impersonate me. A man from the territory who'd done similar work for him before. When I found out, I tried to warn you. I sent the message to Harwell, to the bounty registry, but I was already on the road. Cale thought about the dead man in the telegraph office. The impersonator? Toby's face told him. Faraday eliminated him when the job was done, Cale said. He didn't need a loose thread. He had the warrant already drafted. He had Setch ready to hold you until the marshal arrived and found you with a staged crime scene behind you. The ambush came 11 minutes later, which meant Faraday had followed one of them, probably Toby, and had men positioned in the canyon. 3 riders came from the southern entrance, moving fast. Cale moved before he finished his assessment of the situation, pulling Toby behind the equipment shed wall. They came out the north side and ran for the horses on foot, which was not dignified but was considerably more likely to be survivable than standing and responding to 3-to-1 odds in an enclosed space. One rider cut north ahead of them. Cale altered course, taking Toby east through the canyon's broken floor, over rocks that were hard going for the horses, and the pursuit slowed enough. They reached open desert and rode south with the canyon at their back for the better part of an hour before Cale was satisfied they were clear. Then Toby told him the rest. Deputy Setch was not Faraday's man. Setch was trying to slow the process, had been trying carefully without sufficient authority or evidence to act directly. He had known the dead man wasn't Pruitt because he had quietly investigated the staged body himself. He had warned Cale away from the telegraph office not to protect Goss but to prevent Goss from knowing how much Cale had found. Setch left the ledger page, Cale said slowly. We both did, Toby said. I found it among the papers Faraday burned. Setch was the one who put it under the paperweight. Cale looked at his brother. 12 years of distance pressed between them like a physical weight. He had expected many things when he finally saw Toby again. He had not expected to find him on the right side of a thing, making costly choices, trying to do what Cale had failed to teach him young enough. The betrayal arrived late and came from the direction he had momentarily stopped watching. As they rode into the southern edge of town at dusk, Aldea Pruitt stepped onto her porch with a lantern and said something Cale could not initially interpret. Then 2 men appeared from the alley beside the dry goods store, trail coats, one touching his belt buckle, and he understood that Aldea had not been an innocent misdirection. She had sent for him willingly that morning. She had known what was waiting. She had placed him in the room with the body and the envelope because Faraday had offered her something. Land, money, the clearing of her actual cousin's debts, and she had accepted. Changed understanding, the man Cale had been hunting, and the man hunting Cale were both instruments of the same mechanism. And the mechanism required a territorial official, which meant the marshal riding from Alderton might be arriving to complete the operation rather than disrupt it. They held in the canyon's northern cut through the night, the 2 brothers and Deputy Setch, who had found them an hour after the encounter with Aldea's men. Setch had been trying to reach the territorial marshal's circuit office by a back route when Faraday's riders cut him off. He had circled rather than confronted them, and he had lost his badge somewhere in the scramble. Had it taken, he said flatly, by a man he recognized as having ridden with Faraday's outfit for at least a year. Without the badge, he had no legal standing. He was 50 years old, tired, and he had a precise and complete accounting of every mistake he had made in the past 6 months. I should have arrested Setch 6 months ago, he said, meaning Faraday, and then caught himself. Faraday. I should have arrested Faraday when I first found the altered filing on the Hennessy claim. I had enough. I told myself I needed more. You needed more, Cale said. Because an arrest without territorial backing would have been contested and dismissed. You knew that. I knew that, and I used it as a reason to wait. There's a difference. Setch was honest in the dark in a way that men with badges were rarely honest in daylight. A man named Pell owned the Hennessy claim. He died last winter. His family didn't know the land had value. Faraday transferred it inside 2 weeks of Pell's death. The family got nothing. How many claims? Toby asked. 17 confirmed. Possibly 23. Toby had maintained the ledger. He knew the numbers better than anyone. Total acreage, roughly 4,000. At projected railway-adjacent values. Enough, Cale said. Not because the numbers didn't matter. Because knowing them precisely would not change what needed to happen before the marshal arrived. The marshal, a man named Aldous Creve, whose name Cale knew from the circuit, was due in Cressa Flats by the following afternoon. Cale had worked adjacent to Creve twice in 12 years, and had formed no strong opinion of the man except that he was careful and that he could be persuaded by well-organized evidence. Whether he could be persuaded when the evidence implicated his own territorial land registrar was a different question, and one they could not answer without testing it. Caraday's objective was now clear in its entirety. He needed the warrant against Cale Dunmore processed before Creve could examine the land transfer records. A bounty hunter with an active criminal warrant was not a credible witness in any territorial proceeding. Once Cale was formally charged and held, the ledger evidence, even if it reached Creve, could be challenged as the work of a criminal attempting to deflect his own prosecution. Toby's testimony would be similarly dismissed, the word of a man with a prior territorial conviction against a sitting official. It was elegant in the way that genuinely corrupt operations sometimes were, each piece supporting the others, each piece defensible individually. The morning brought fog off the desert, which was unusual enough that Cale took it as either an omen or a practical gift and chose to treat it as the latter. Under its cover, he moved back into town alone, which Setch objected to and Toby did not, because Toby understood the kind of man Cale had spent 12 years becoming. He needed 3 things: the physical warrant with his name on it, the original land transfer documents that Caraday had not yet destroyed, and Goss. He got 2 of them. Goss, confronted quietly in the back of the telegraph office before the town fully woke, was frightened enough to talk. He confirmed the messages to Alderton, confirmed that Caraday had dictated them, confirmed that the warrant had been drafted by Caraday himself using a territorial seal that should only have been held by the marshal's office. He would not testify to this in writing. He would not testify to it publicly. But he gave Cale the copies of the outgoing messages that he had kept. Not out of conscience, Cale suspected, but out of the insurance instinct of a man who understood he was working for someone dangerous. In Caraday's office, the locked land registry, which was not as secure as a locked door might suggest to a man who had spent his earlier years learning which locks yielded to which pressures, Cale found the remaining transfer documents in a satchel that had been packed for rapid departure. Caraday had been planning to leave before the marshal arrived. Cale realized. The warrant against Cale had bought him time, not permanence. He was going to take his documentation, his money, and his exit before anyone could properly examine any of it. The warrant itself, his own warrant, was in the satchel too. He held it for a long moment. He could destroy it. No warrant, no formal charges. He could take the documents to Creve and present himself as the man who had uncovered the scheme. Clean, relatively. But the warrant bore a territorial seal, and destroying a document with a territorial seal was a crime. And there were witnesses who had seen it, including Setch and Goss. And Caraday would simply deny it, produce his own account, and pivot to whichever story served him. The only way through was the way that required Cale to walk into the place where capture was most likely and trust that what he carried would be enough. He put the warrant back in the satchel. He took the satchel. He walked out of the land registry and toward the jail. Changed understanding. Cale Dunmore was not going to run. He had run once, 12 years ago, and had spent every year since understanding what that cost. Marshal Aldous Creve arrived 4 hours early, which either meant the message about the body had alarmed him sufficiently to push his pace or meant he had been closer than the territorial schedule suggested. He came with 2 deputies and a territorial clerk, which was more administrative apparatus than a simple warrant execution would require. Cale saw this from the boarding house window and adjusted his interpretation of the morning accordingly. Creve was a compact man in his late 50s with a gray cavalry beard and the careful eyes of someone who had learned to look twice at things that appeared obvious. He went directly to the jail and met with Setch, reinstated provisionally, wearing a spare badge that Cale had found in the jail desk drawer, for 40 minutes. Cale waited. When Creve came out of the jail, he looked up the street and found Cale standing in front of the Meridian Saloon with the satchel at his feet. He walked toward Cale without hurrying. His 2 deputies stayed at the jail door. "You're Dunmore," Creve said. "I am. I have a warrant for your arrest." "You have a warrant that says Cale Dunmore committed 3 crimes in this county over the past 2 weeks," Cale said. I can demonstrate I wasn't in this county for any of them, with a documented record from the Territorial Registry at Harwell showing my bounty submission on the Foss brothers. Date stamped. Witnessed 3 days before the first crime on that warrant. I can also show you who did commit those crimes, who created the warrant, and why. Creve looked at the satchel. And this. The land transfer documents from Caraday's registry. 17 confirmed fraudulent filings. The original ledger copies my brother maintained. The telegraph message copies that Goss kept. And the warrant with your territorial seal, which Caraday used without your authorization. Creve was quiet for a moment. Then, the registrar has standing to draft warrants under a specific territorial provision that requires co-signature from a sitting marshal or judge, Cale said. This warrant carries no co-signature, just the seal. He held Creve's gaze. I suspect the seal was taken from your office. I suspect you may want to check whether it is currently where it should be. Creve's expression did not change visibly, but something shifted behind his eyes. He had already checked, or he had already known. Where is Caraday? Creve asked. That's the question, Cale said. Caraday had not been in his office, nor in his rooms at the boarding house, nor at any of the obvious exits from town. But the piano player at the Meridian, the young man with the badly healed wrist, had been playing his 3-note sequence since 7 in the morning, which was unusual for a saloon that didn't open until 9. Cale had noticed it through the window. He had been noticing it since the second night. He went inside, Creve following, and sat down beside the piano player, who stopped playing immediately and looked terrified. What does the signal mean? Cale asked quietly. What does it tell him? The boy, he was perhaps 16, and clearly not a willing participant in whatever arrangement he had been pressed into, said that it meant the road south was clear. He had been told to play it every morning when no one was watching the southern road. If he stopped or changed the sequence, something would happen to his mother, who was indebted to Caraday through a land claim of her own. How does he receive it? Creve asked. The boy pointed to the saloon's back window, which faced south across an open lot and then across a clear line of sight to the canyon's southern entrance. Setch was already gone. He had taken Creve's 2 deputies and ridden south when Cale sent word through Toby 20 minutes earlier, betting that Caraday would wait for the all-clear signal before moving. He would not leave until he knew the road was unwatched. He had too much documentation, too much weight to carry, to risk an open road without confirmation. They found Caraday's horse hitched inside the canyon's southern entrance, loaded with 2 saddlebags. They found Caraday himself walking his horse forward slowly, waiting for the signal's final note. He was arrested without gunfire. Setch put the irons on him personally, which seemed to matter to Setch in some way that Cale understood and did not comment on. The trial was conducted in Alderton 6 weeks later. Cale testified for 2 days. Toby testified for 3, with his prior territorial conviction on record and acknowledged. Goss testified, having accepted an arrangement that reduced his exposure in exchange for full cooperation. Setch testified and was commended for his conduct in the investigation, which was accurate enough to be satisfying even if it omitted certain delays. Aldea Pruitt was charged as an accessory. She entered a plea and received a reduced sentence, 2 years, served in the territorial facility at Benson. Cale did not attend that portion of the proceedings. He had no particular feeling about her that he could articulate cleanly. Caraday received 15 years. The land transfers were unwound where the original owners or their families could be located. 7 of the 17 families recovered full or partial value. The remaining claims went into a territorial remediation fund, which was a legal mechanism Cale had not known existed until the clerk explained it to him. The warrant with Cale's name was voided and formally expunged from the territorial record. He watched the clerk stamp it. He thought briefly about keeping it and then decided against it. Toby was given a conditional release from his prior conviction following his testimony, a legal outcome that Cale had not engineered but that Creve had supported. They stood outside the courthouse in Alderton in the late afternoon sun, and were brothers in the way that men are brothers when they have spent 12 years apart and cannot recover any of it but can choose what to do with what remains. Where will you go? Cale asked. There's a land claim available, Toby said. Legitimate one. Northern Ridge area. It's cheap because nobody's built a rail line yet. You think they will? I think the survey maps don't lie. Toby almost smiled. I've read enough of them. Cale looked south, where the Comanche Trace extended across the desert toward every county he had worked in the past 12 years. I'll send for you, Toby said. When the line comes through. Cale nodded. He did not promise to come. He did not promise not to. Changed understanding, final. The man Cale Dunmore had been hunting for 12 years, without knowing it, was the version of himself that had walked away from a canyon before dawn and never turned back. He had not caught that man, but he had stopped running from him, which was possibly the more difficult accomplishment. Marshal Creve had one last conversation with Cale on the morning Cale rode out of Alderton. The bounty on the Foss brothers, Creve said, standing at the livery. $400. You're owed it. I know, Cale said. And nothing for Pruitt. He was never properly in custody. I know that too. Creve held out an envelope. The 400. And a formal letter of conduct from this office. In case you continue the work. Cale took the envelope. He did not open it at the livery. He opened it 2 miles south of Alderton on an empty road, and found the $400 and the letter, and also found a small note in Creve's handwriting. The warrant was void. But the life it described was real. Don't waste the difference. He folded the note and put it in his coat pocket beside the silver coin with the double loop mark, which he had never thrown away and did not entirely understand why. He rode south for 2 days and then east, through country he knew and country he didn't, past the kind of towns where people had come to stop being whoever they had been before and had not yet settled into whoever they were becoming. He stopped in one of these towns for a night. The saloon had a piano player who only knew cheerful songs, which Cale found restoring in a way he couldn't fully explain. He was not a reformed man in any dramatic sense. He had done work that required hardness and he was still capable of it. He had walked away from his brother at 19 and there was no accounting entry that balanced that, only the ongoing obligation of not walking away again. He had built 12 years of a livelihood on finding people who did not want to be found, and he had done it with sufficient honesty that he could still sleep. What changed was small and true. He no longer needed the money from every warrant to prove something he had stopped being able to name. Somewhere east, Toby was looking at land surveys and calculating the future in a language that their father, who had never owned anything, would not have recognized. Somewhere in the Territorial Archive at Alderton, a voided warrant bearing the name Cale Dunmore was filed in a folder marked expunged, procedurally invalid, which was accurate and incomplete and would satisfy no one who read it carefully. Could you have trusted a guilty man when he was the only person telling the truth? And if you could, what does that say about the truth or about guilt or about the distance between who we were and who we are still trying to become? Somewhere in the eastern counties, where a rail line will eventually run through land that was stolen and partially recovered, a man named Dunmore works a claim under his own name because he decided that was worth the exposure. His brother rides through once or twice a year. The wind carries names across the high desert without caring who they belong to. Some of them were true. Some were borrowed. Some were worn like coats for warmth and then set aside when the season changed. Cale Dunmore's name was on a wanted poster once. Then it wasn't. That is not the same as the name being clean, only that it survived, which in that country in that time was as much as most names managed.